Howdy folks, old Buster coming to you again. Got a little story about my Aunt Rosie. Named this story Aunt Rosie after her. Now Jesse, you're my kin and best friend, and I ain't going to let you to get loose, you hear me? Now you're going to go with me to Aunt Rosie's on Saturday for dinner. Aunt Rosie was on Buster's great-grandma's side. She was a Sylvester. That was Grandpa Gus's ma's maiden name. My grandma, Buster's grandma. Well, you know I'm Buster. You know, the fixin' is going to be right smart for everybody, and you don't have to eat no corn or nothing sappy. Well, Aunt Mary's going to bring them 5-gallon tins of baked goods first, and I'm going to ask Aunt Rosie for chicken and dumplings and knedlings. I just dearly love that stuff, and you know I can eat my weight in it. Jesse said, now dang it, Buster, them gals is going to be there that wants me to spoon with them, and I just don't rightly cotton to them. Buster told Jesse that wasn't going to happen, 'cause them married gals is off to their grandma's house in the valley for the summer, so don't fret none about that. Well, Buster's grandma had Jesse and Buster to pick dandelions for greens and wine, and Buster flopped down on the ground and picked himself a dandelion and blew on it and watched the wind carry away the fluff. The fluff was spores that reproduced to make more dandelions. Well, Buster and Jesse also climbed the maple tree to watch the seeds float down to the ground like little helicopters, just passing the time and deciphering on the wonder of nature. Well, that evening, when the boys got on back to the house with their load of dandelions, Grandma about had supper fixed up for them. Buster and his and Grandma and Grandpa Gus ate the roast pork and dumplings and mashed taters and gravy and corn. Buster mixed his plate with some sauerkraut and lapped up his first helping in no time flat. That iced tea sure was good, sweet and just right. Now Jesse got him a salad bigger than a mixing bowl along with his and roast pork. Jesse didn't like no corn or nothing sappy, as everybody knowed, so Grandma would always fix something special for Jesse. It was still daylight, and Grandpa Gus asked if the boys wanted to ride into town with him for a bit, then he would carry Jesse on over to his house. Well, they all stopped over at Leek's drugstore, and the boys got them some ice cream whilst Grandpa Gus talked to Atticus Cobb for a spell. They was all a-talking about the coming gin season and how Grandpa Gus's rice and beans was a-coming along. Well, after a bit, they all went over to Jesse's, and Ms. McBrayer had some fresh coffee she just made up and offered Grandpa Gus a cup and a piece of apple pie right out the oven. Him and Mac, Mr. McBrayer, visited a while, and they had their pie about and talked about what all they was happening in town, and somebody that throwed 16 cholera hogs in the bayou. Oh, got a fly around there somewhere. Of course, Buster had to have some too with a quart of milk. He dearly loved apple pie just as much. Jesse's ma told Jesse he ought to eat like Buster, and Jesse told her he weren't that big, so he couldn't. She told Jesse she just didn't want him getting sick is all. Feed a cold, starve a fever, she said. Well, Buster and Grandpa Gus said their goodbyes and left on out. Both of them boys were ready for their feather beds, 'cause their ma and pa wasn't going to let no daylight burn, I guarantee you that. The next morning, Buster drove up to the house and asked Miss McBrayer if Jesse could go with him to the farm and pick elderberries so his Uncle George could make some wine. Well, Buster said they'd bring her a mess too. Buster told her it'd be nigh on the evening before they got back, and his and Grandpa Gus was already in the field, and Grandma had dinner buckets made up for them. When Buster and Jesse filled up all their lard cans with elderberries, they went over to where Grandpa Gus was walking levees barefoot, of course. He told the boys there was a case of shotgun shells and 2 shotguns in the truck, and to go shoot the blackbirds in the field. You see, the blackbirds would eat the rice. Maybe not kill so many of them, but you scare them off. Well, like I say, not that they'd kill many, if any, but would scare them away from the crop, and Buster and Jesse shot them guns till the barrels was plumb pert and they're red hot. Leastways so a body couldn't touch them. Well, after all the shells was gone, the boys took a little dip in the canal and then chunked a few rocks off an Indian Bayou bridge and some bottles were floating by. Well, late spring and summer was always best for the boys in the South, but hunting season was good too. Summer was best though. Well, Buster and Jesse went duck hunting on the farm last year and got their mess of ducks. Each time they went, they done a little trapping and rabbit hunting too. Buster's favorite hunting was for quail and frogs though. You just had to watch for the water moccasins and cottonmouths when frog gigging. Couldn't keep catching them with your hand because you get bit. Well, one thing, the boys always ate good. They didn't have much money when they was youngins, but had a high old time. Their other two friends, Walter and Howard, would get together with them, but their paws had them working and couldn't get away as much as Jesse and Buster could. Well, Buster lived closer to Jesse, and they could get over to each other's lots, get over to each other's house lots easier than Walter and Howard could. Now, Howard lived pretty close too, but his and Pa had him operating heavy equipment since he was a little tyke to make a living, so he was mostly busy except on Sundays, sometimes Saturdays. Walter lived out on the ranch, and his and Pa sure enough kept his and three boys and two girls hard at it. So most of the time it was Jesse and Buster. Well, Saturday come and Jesse and his and folks rode on over with Grandma and Grandpa Gus to Aunt Rosie's place on out towards Hazen. It was only about 12 miles to where they was a-going, so it didn't take too long to get there, you know. Well, first thing, right off the bat, the boys got their hair tousled and cheeks pinched and told how big they was a-getting. Buster and Jesse lit a shuck and went on out to the barn to see the new piglets and chicks. There was a new calf or two, and old Emma had a foal. One of the youngsters come up to Buster and Jesse and told them that Aunt Rosie wanted to see them and be quick about it. Well, they come a-running, you know. When Buster come up to Aunt Rosie, she asked him what all he wanted for dinner. Well, Buster went to grinning from ear to ear. Chicken and dumplings and cannellini too, he hollered, a-jumping up and down. Well, Aunt Rosie looked over to Jesse and asked what all he wanted for dinner, and he said hamburgers, kind of sheepish-like, you know. Well, Aunt Rosie told Buster and Jesse to fetch that old hen out back and bring her to her. Well, they did, and when they got on back with the hen, Aunt Rosie wrung her neck and put her in a boiling water pot and get the feathers off. Whilst they was preparing the chicken, Aunt Rosie looked over to Jesse and told him she was going to make him two of the biggest and best hamburgers he ever ate. Now, Jesse dearly loved them hamburgers and go to town on them, I tell you. Jesse didn't get many of them at home because his and Pa didn't raise no beef, but he sure enough got some on Saturday after the picture show, which all the youngins in and around town would go to the evening. Well, after all the eating and visiting, Buster and Jesse and their folks headed on back to their places. Jesse said he wanted Buster to stay over at his house after the picture show, and Grandma said that'd be fine with her. Grandpa Gus give Buster his dime for the week and said to be on home tomorrow evening. Now, Buster done had him a rule. Wasn't going to be no chocolate-covered raisins around him. One time at the picture show, the boy behind the counter gave Buster them chocolate-covered raisins instead of chocolate-covered peanuts, and Buster got sicker than a dog during the picture show and throwed up every which place. Now, Miss Inez had to stop the picture show, clean up the mess, and Buster didn't get to see Tom Mix that day. Buster was plumb put out about that, I tell you. Them chocolate-covered raisins was about as bad as a slinky or liver or beets as far as Buster was concerned. He hated them all. If you wanted to see a feller riled, just give Buster some of them to eat. Buster couldn't even stand to be around the nasty tasting things. Worser than poison, he said, trying to kill him. Well, Jesse told Buster that there was going to be a picnic out at Clear Lake after church on Sunday and asked if he wanted to go. Well, sure enough, Buster said. He knowed his and folks would go too, and he just couldn't wait. Hot dogs and popcorn with butter, tater salad with tater chips, homemade ice cream, hamburgers, just a mountain of other delicious food to graze on, as well as hot dogs. I think I said that, didn't I? Hog heaven was what that was, Buster told Jesse. Of course, they had certain foods that their folks all made that was real good. So other than that, they had all kinds of dishes. Of course, they'd have to wait for an hour or so till their dinner settled for the women folk to let any young'un go swimming. Last time Buster went a swimming, his and Mama was in from working at the airport with her friend Rita Patty that Grandma and Grandpa Gus raised for a spell. They all went to Peckerwood Lake, and Buster dove in and hit a rock. Buster busted open his and hey. Well, Buster's mama liked to have a conniption fit. when Buster come up out of the water with him a-bleeding everywhere. It was the end of swimming that day, I tell you for sure. Buster still carries a scar on his forehead to this day. Now, Buster was a right good swimmer, though. He taught himself to swim by watching the other young'uns. He seed how they was a-doing it and just jumped on in. He blubbered a bit, but took to it like a duck to water. Just paddled on. Some folks thought he ought to be in them Olympics you hear so much about. But nobody knows much about all that in these here parts. But he was a swimmer. He could, in fact, go fast. Buster was a talker. He would talk the brass horns off a billy goat. Jesse just didn't say much till you got him wound up. When you did, he was a magpie. Only his thing, it just took him so long to tell a body something. He was so slow at talking that you didn't know if he was beginning or ending and what all he was a-saying. Well, like was told, Jesse and Buster was two peas in a pod, a regular Mutt and Jeff, and where one went, the other went too. Now, when Jesse went off to Mississippi to visit his Uncle Rich, Buster just didn't know what to do with himself and always got into some kind of mischief when Jesse was gone. Telling on myself, Walter and Hired would call or get a loose every once in a while, and Buster could go over to their place, but they was a-working and couldn't do nothing much. Of course, the eating was good, but just wasn't no time for 'em to do nothing and have no fun or adventure. It got so bad Jesse's folks had to take Buster along with them too, 'cause he was fretting. Now there just wasn't going to be nobody to devil Jesse, man, woman, or child. Buster would be in their eyes like a coon, I tell you. Now old Buster would ball up on you and tell whoever was a-bothering Jesse to get on him, 'cause he dearly would love that, and when they got through with him, if and they could, then they could have words with Jesse. None never did. Now Buster's mama remarried, and Buster had a half-brother named Gary, but they wasn't close. Buster didn't see him none excepting when his mama come. Well, Buster did have two sisters, but Jesse had two sisters, but they pretty much stayed to themselves and about on their own, you know. Funny thing about when Jesse and Buster was growing up, and to this day, they would always seem to know what the other was thinking or going to say. Them boys was plumb stuck together like glue. Their folks just didn't know what all was going to happen when they got older. They just figured time would tell and they could deal with it then. As different as them two boys was, they was that much alike. Dangest thing you ever seen. Now that didn't mean them two didn't think a heap about Hired and Walter. It was just that they couldn't be around as much as Jesse could and Buster could. Now Jesse and Hired was more of in-town boys, where Buster and Walter was on the farm and ranch. Buster was just on the outskirts of town, where Walter was on 20th and Plum. That's 20 miles out of town and Plum and the Sticks. Each of them boys was right special to each other, and that's a fact. Well, Buster asked some fellers that come in third place at the Memphis and May barbecue cook-off to cook for a little party the local boys at the dryer throwed every year. Reason is that Grandpa Gus was part owner of the dryer, and Buster told him how good these fellers was, and it would be a real treat to put a lip lock on what all they'd cook up. Well, Buster had a special request for barbecue bologna. Well, Jesse wanted some hamburgers and Walter wanted ribs. Hired said he just had to have a brisket, and all of them told the boys that was a cooking to throw on whatever else they wanted to. There sure enough was going to be a right smart of a crowd, I tell you. About like the crawdad boil and fish fry that was put on every year, and the duck supper too. Put on by the FFA and the Agri shop at the schoolhouse, and the Ducks Unlimited for the duck supper. The coon supper was in the fall of the year, and the politicians that was voted on, and the duck supper during the World Duck Calling Contest over in Stuttgart. There was always something to cook in summers, I tell you, and it was all good too. Now, Mexican food wasn't found much back then, excepting when Walter's pa brung in some hired hands from the border for custom cutting he done during harvest season. Now, Walter would travel with his and pa to all the grain producing states like Kansas, especially wheat growing states. That's how hard cash was made by his and pa, and Walter and his brothers had to go along helping. Every once in a while, they'd have some of them Mexican boys cook up some of their victuals and invite the boys and their folks over to supper. It was right tasty, but not quite like what all they was used to. Of course, the women folk made pies and homemade ice cream to cool them off some of that hot stuff them Mexican boys put in their food. Buster went and got Jesse, and they took off to the river bottoms to run. Whilst they was a-running, they seen some of the boys from school that run track and run with them for a bit. Well, they come up on the razorback sow with Piglets, and she didn't take kindly with them boys around her youngins. She come a-charging after them, and the boys lit a shot. Now, Buster was real fast. Real fast. But Jesse sure could scoot, too. They went a-sailing by them track boys lickety-split and jumped a ravine, and gully is what I'd call it, and clumb a tree to take in the sight. Them boys didn't quite make the gully and had to climb a cottonwood tree to get to safety. Jesse and Buster clumb down and got some clods and sticks and run off the sow and got the boys back on their way. Them track boys said they was going to stop for dinner off of the old logging road where one of their paws was awaiting and asked them if they wanted to eat with them. Well, that didn't take Buster long to tell them, heck yeah, I'm a-telling you. Well, the boys all run to where they was a-meeting up for dinner, and Wilton told his and Pa what done happened. Well, Matthew Wallace was Wilton's pa, and he had the grill fired up and hamburgers ready to cook. Well, Mr. Wallace had several coolers in the back of his truck chock full of cokes and all manner of victuals them track boys' maws fixed up. Tater salad, tater chips, hot dogs, pickles, baked beans, fried pies was there. Well, Mr. Wallace shouldn't have told Buster to pile on in and eat his and fill, 'cause he done just that. Buster done drank 22 of them small Coca-Colas and ate 6 double hamburgers and 4 hot dog sandwiches, each of them piled 4 dogs high. Plus he done ate pert near a plate full of baked beans and a plate full of tater salad and a bag of tater chips along with it. Well, them boys and Mr. Wallace was plumb bumfuzzled over Buster's eating, I tell you. Well, Jesse told Wilton his and Pa shouldn't have told Buster to eat his and fill, and he ain't even started on them fried pies, which he loved dearly, said Jesse. But them fried peach pies didn't have a chance. He done put away a dozen of them before you could shake a stick at a steak. Well, after dinner, the track boys were ready to finish their run and headed on out. Well, Jesse and Buster had to find a bush before they left on out. When they come back, Mr. Wallace was in a tizzy. He had a flat tire and no jack and was in the middle of nowhere. Well, Buster told Mr. Wallace there weren't no problem and told Jesse to fetch a chunk over there beside the road. Well, Buster went around to the back of the truck and hunkered down and grabbed a hold of the bumper. Well, Buster then told Jesse to slide the chunk up under the axle when he lifted her up. Well, Buster bowed up and poured the coal to her and lifted the rear into that truck like it weren't nothing of that at all to it. Well, Jesse slid the chunk up under the axle, and then Buster let her down and got the tire irons from Mr. Wallace, took off the lug nuts, and changed the tire. Well, after tightening the lug nuts, Buster went to the back of the truck and lifted it up, had Jesse get the chunk out from under the axle, and Buster told Mr. Wallace he was a-raring to go, but did he reckon he could have another one of them cokes? If there was any left. Well, Mr. Wallace just stood there with his mouth wide open, a-gawking at Buster. He told Jesse he ain't never seen nothing like that in all his born days. Jesse told him that ain't nothing. You ought to see him when he's riled. Well, Buster drank his and coke, and Jesse had one too for the road, and they waved goodbye and headed on back to the house. Now, speaking of lifting things, Jesse seed Buster whilst they was over to visit some friends from the schoolhouse. He lifted up a boat, motor, and trailer. It weren't no littling neither. The feller next door to these folks had pulled into his driveway at an angle and got the motor buried up in the roadbed in the asphalt. Well, the lady wanted to leave on out to the store, but was blocked in. Well, Buster got on up and told Jesse to come on out with him. Well, Buster told the feller to hold on and then commenced to tell him how they was going to get that there boat loose. Well, Buster told the feller and Jesse he was going to lift her up, and when he hollered to Jesse, Jesse would relay what Buster wanted him to do. Well, the feller got on in his Jeep, and when Buster lifted that boat, motor, and trailer up, he told Jesse to tell the feller to pull up, but slow. Because he had to walk that rig out with him of driving. Well, Buster lifted that rig and backed up the driveway whilst Jesse had the feller in his Jeep, drove real slow like Buster told him, and got it all cleared. Buster set him down, and Jesse told the feller to stop. Buster waved to the feller and went on into the house where they was a-visiting and told the lady she could get on out now and go to the store. Now that story, along with lots of others, got round real quick in town. Buster was cornbread stout, was what Jesse told folks. Walter, Howard, and Jesse had known that for a long time, nothing new to them. It was late spring and the boys was at the schoolhouse when Clyde Outman, there was an Inman and an Outman, the Outman was plumb out of his mind to tackle Buster. He just didn't know what all he got himself into coming to Buster. There was a new thing where a feller would pop a belt loop on a feller's Levi's, and Clyde done this to Buster. Now Clyde was a few years older than Buster and thought it would be real funny to do that to Buster's jeans. Well, when Clyde popped Buster's belt loop, it tore loose. That wasn't funny at all. Them jeans cost good money and hard cash was hard to come by, you know, in them days. Well, sir, Buster spoke his mind to Clyde, and Clyde figured to buffalo Buster since he was older. That wasn't going to happen, I tell you. Well, there was a bit of a fracas, and Clyde ended up in the fish pond fountain in front of the schoolhouse. He was wetter than a frog, and I reckon he had to get on back home to get him some dry breeches. Seems like Buster was always having somebody a-picking on him just to try him on for size since he was bigger than about most folks. Once there was a little tussle on Halloween when a bunch of rowdy old boys was picking on boys they come up to stuffing them in trash cans. Well, Buster just happened to be walking down by the alley in back of a feller's house named Charlie Henson that he knowed. This here bunch of hooligans was trying to stuff old Charlie in a garbage can when Buster come up on him. Now Buster hollered to them to turn Charlie loose, but they wasn't about to do that and told Buster to make what all he wanted of it, that he was going to be next. Well, Buster done just that, and the fight was on. Needless to say, Charlie wasn't stuffed in no garbage can. But Buster got himself in a pickle over that, I tell you. Buster picked this feller up by the seat of his breeches and the nape of his neck and flung him plumb through the end of a garage that backed up to the alley. Now Buster didn't mean to hurt the feller, just wanted to get him away from the tussle. Danged if he didn't know his own strength, you know. Well, Buster slung that feller and put his hay plumb through them boards on that garage. Had to get the fire department to get the boy loose. When Jesse, Howard, and Walter found out Buster didn't come home for supper, they knowed something was wrong. They all went a-hunting for Buster and found him up in a favorite tree of his and looking up at the stars, just a pieball looking as all get out. Well, Walter hollered up to Buster to get on down from that tree, him. What you doing up there? Buster hollered back he wasn't going to come down right yet. He was a-thinking. Them other boys had hollered to Buster that they was going to get to the police and Buster was going to jail. Buster just had to figure out what all he was going to do about telling his Grandpa Gus and Mama about all this here before he could come on and go home. Well, all the boys climbed the tree and talked to Buster about what all happened. They told him he was just a-helping the feller that needed help, and if the other boy got hurt, it wasn't his doing. Fact was, there was 5 or 6 of them boys, and just Buster had taken up for Charlie, and Charlie wasn't no help no way. Well, Buster told Jesse he was sure enough hungry, and if he didn't care, could he stay over till morning? If and so, he would call his grandma and tell her. If it was all right with Jesse's ma. In the morning, Buster was going to go see the police and see if they wanted him. Well, all the boys thought that was a right smart idea and headed over to Jesse's house. When they got there, Ms. McBrayer fixed all the boys something to eat, and Buster eat 4 ham sandwiches before you could bat an eye. Oh, after about 3/4 of a dewberry pie and a quart of milk, Jesse come up for air. About that time, Buster's folks drove up. Mr. McBrayer had called them and the police chief too. Bud Berry was the chief's name, and they was all let into the house and gathered up in the parlor. Buster told his folks he was going to go see the chief in the morning and didn't want to fret 'em none. Well, the chief and pert near the rest of the town done knowed what all happened, and Grandpa's Gus had done spoke to the boy's pa and that had his hay put through the end of the garage. The boy had done been took to the hospital and was going to be all right. The other boys and their folks had been talked to too by the chief. The chief told Buster he wasn't in no trouble, but he just needed to be a bit more careful of where he was a-slinging people. The chief knowed who started the fracas and how many of them there was, and it was just Buster taking up for Charlie and his himself. Now Charlie's folks was another matter. They was right put out that all them other boys ganged up on Charlie and was right appreciative that Buster helped him out. The chief said he figured everybody learned a lesson and just forget the whole business. Buster's grandpa Gus told him to do just what was right. Don't start no trouble, but don't run neither. Them boys could have hurt Charlie, and then where would they be? Buster was just doing what the good book says, but Buster's grandma looking out for his neighbor. Said Buster's grandma was just looking out for his neighbor. When Buster's folks left on out, Grandpa Gus turned to Buster and told him to be on home about dinner, cause Buster had to take him to the courthouse for some business over at the county seat. The county fair was starting that evening, and he told the rest of the boys if they wanted to come along and stay for the fair, they was welcome. Boy howdy, that sure enough put grins on all their faces, I tell you. He also said it'd be late to tell their folks they could all stay over with Buster that night. Buster had butter on a biscuit with homemade peach jam Mrs. Dollinger had sent over to Jesse's ma, and a couple of pieces of leftover bacon before they went to bed. Walter and Hired had to get on back for early morning chores so they could go at dinner the next day with Buster and his and Grandpa Gus. Buster was known to eat right smart, and he had an uncle from the city that come to town to see if he could fill that boy up. The last time they visited, he brung Buster a bunch of nanners and a gallon of ice cream. He sure thought he had Buster, but he got himself a big surprise. Buster ate the whole dang thing, all of it. Well, this time Buster's uncle took him to the Magnolia Cafe, where you could get all you could eat for $1. Well, after Buster lit into that buffet line about 6 or 7 times, the manager come over and asked Buster and his uncle to leave. They just couldn't afford to feed that boy, he said. Well, Buster got to eat all he wanted from Charlie Henson's great aunt's cafe down by the railroad tracks. Ever since Buster helped Charlie, them ladies went to feeding Buster when he was around. They said they had to keep up Buster's strength since the growing boy needed his nourishment, and somebody just might need his help. Well, Buster sure did like their plate lunches, that's for sure. Nothing like homemade victuals, and he said their bread pudding was the best. Every time Buster and his Grandma and Grandpa Gus went on a trip, Grandma had to make up extra food to take with them. Grandma O said it was a full-time job trying to keep that boy filled up. He had a holler leg. Why, when she went to the grocery store, she had to find hiding places for all the things Buster liked that she bought for his dinner bucket that he took to the field. Them peanut butter cookies was bad enough to hide, but nanners was the worst. Buster would smell them out every time. One thing about it, ain't nobody ever told Buster what to eat, how much to eat, when to eat, and never will. That boy surely could eat and was said to have a holler leg like I told you. The first place Buster would head to was the kitchen when he hit the door. Wasn't nothing safe in the refrigerator. Well, all the boys' maws and paws too knowed about Buster and his and eating. Funny thing is, he was skinny as a rail for his and size. Reckon with all his and working all the time on the farm and at the dryer, burned it all off the boy. Fact is, ain't none of the boys ever backed down from a chore and always lent a helping hand to whoever needed it. Now all the boys were right smart. Like has been told before this, when they hollered brains, the boys didn't think they was saying rain and run into the house. They sure enough had a passel of them, even though each one of them kind of settled into a role they was satisfied with. Each one of them was right comfortable in their own skins. Well, one Saturday the boys stopped at the pool hall on Main Street for a game of snooker and a hamburger. Now the pool hall was a right famous place for hamburgers, and folks from miles around come to get them. All the farmers round about order them for their hired hands for dinner. Why, at dinner time the line was so long you couldn't get to eat till near about 3 o'clock if you didn't put your order in ahead of time. Well, whilst the boys was shooting some snooker, Buster ordered up 4 hamburgers and a couple of 3 Cokes. Them in the little bottle. Well, Buster left on out early of a morning and didn't get right enough to eat because he was in such a hurry to finish up his chores so he could meet up with the boys. After them first 4 hamburgers, he done ordered up 4 more. Well, Mr. Jones, who owned the pool hall, hollered over to Buster and asked him just how many he was going to eat. Mr. Jones said he was going to have to send out for some more meat if Buster wanted any more hamburgers, and would he go on and get his and fill, because he didn't need no advertising on how good they was. Said he wasn't going to be able to feed the hands coming in from the field and folks that was in town because of how many he was eating. Well, everybody in the pool hall was just a-howling at that, I tell you. Some men folk playing dominoes got in on the act as soon as Buster ate them other 4 hamburgers. The men folk bought him 4 more. Well, Mr. Jones was fit to be tired of running back and forth them hamburgers and finally had Red, the cripple feller that worked there racking balls for him, to go fetch fresh meat from the butcher shop round the corner. Well, old Buster was the talk of the town that day after eating 12 hamburgers. Buster said when they left on out and somebody asked him how he could eat 12 hamburgers, he said that them hamburgers tasted mighty fine, but they ain't that big. Oh, Buster dearly loved to go to Jesse's house because Jesse didn't eat but just certain things, and he would get Jesse's corn and anything sappy, as he called it. Walter's house was real good too because his and Ma had a big brood to feed, and there was always plenty to eat if you was company. Hired's Ma, on the other hand, didn't cook like that, even though Hired had a brother and a sister. His and family was kind of fancy, like I'd say, in how they set a table. At Buster's there was just him and his and Grandma and Grandpa Gus, but Grandma learned to cook right smart a batch of everything when it come to feeding time. Now, each one of the boys' ma's cooked a lot alike, but Buster's grandma, she fixed old country food a lot too. When the boys each visited with their other families, they got to try out different kinds of cooking and dishes they made. It was always a pleasure for Buster to go along for a picnic or family gathering. Buster said he always got fuller than a tick when he did, just wasn't no leftovers. Well, Jesse and Buster done had to do something they ain't never done. They was a-going to church camp. Now, Walter and Hired was a-working and just couldn't get a way to go, but they said there just might be a way if and all their ma's got in on it and set their foot down to their paws about the Lord and the good book. Them boys knowed their ma's would have the last say, and 1 or 2 of their paws might sull up a mite, but would get over it. The boys just had to work it right. Well, first off, Ms. McBrayer had to let it be her ID. So Jesse and the boys went over to Jesse's house and had some pie and cookies and told her that there was a meeting at the church and they would like to go. Well, Ms. McBrayer was plumb tickled pink to hear them boys say they was going to go more to church and was going to move heaven and earth to get them there. Well, she sure did call all the boys' ma's and tell them she was taking them to the church house for a meeting and they'd be home later that evening. The boys knowed they was going to talk about the church camp that night, and when Ms. McBrayer heard that, she'd been happier than a lark. The boys said they would surely like to hear all them preachers have some fun too. Ms. McBrayer talked to the preacher and people there that was going to head up to camp, and they told her that the meetings at the camp was going to be getting young folks into the service of the Lord, preaching and such. That done it right there. Them boys just had to go. When they all got back to the house, Ms. McBrayer invited all the boys' ma's over for tea and quilting the next day. Now, she surely put on the dog about all the boys being interested in going to camp and how interested they was in the meeting. All the ma's asked her if and she believed that was true or if and the boys had something up their sleeve. Well, Ms. McBrayer said there just couldn't be because of where they going to be, and that was up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere. She said all the boys jumped smack dab in the middle of what all was going on at the meeting and even quoting Bible verses. Well, them ma's knowed their boys had the faith in Jesus and all and knowed the Bible, but quoting scripture was something else in front of folks. Especially after the drinking of the wine and getting themselves knockered that Sunday a while back. Well, all the ladies figured all their praying done some good, and the boys was turning over a new leaf. Now, not to say them boys wasn't good boys, but they was into something all the time, and you know they dearly loved the Lord and Jesus and the Holy Ghost. Well, sir, the women folk got it done. The boys was a-going to church camp. Off they went the next Sunday afternoon after dinner on the ground, and a nice little talk from the preacher. All the boys knowed and liked Preacher Templeton, even though all of them went to different churches. Plus, he liked wine too, as well as a little nip of something stronger every once in a while, for what they call medicinal purposes. Well, all the young'uns and adults loaded up in an old church bus and lit on out for camp. Well, after they got there to a place in the woods called Lonsdale, all of them got settled in. There was barracks with bunk beds and a cook shack too. The gals was separate from the boys, one on each side of the camp, with the counselors sleeping quarter smack dab in the middle, twixt the boys and the girls' barracks. Outhouses was to the side of each barrack so the body could see who flung the chunk of a night. Well, now everybody met up in the evening for what they called the vespers, and was introduced and told what all they was going to do. There was a local boy in with the boys, and they hit it right off the bat. His name was Hubert Dixon, and he was a pretty good old boy. Trouble sure was a-coming. First off, they about caved in Buster, with Walter not far behind because of him not feeding him enough to keep a bird alive, he said. Well, old Hubert said to the boys whilst they was a-swimming the next day that they could slip off to his house through the woods, and his ma had plenty to eat. Well, now, they done just that. Hubert's ma was a real nice lady and whooped up some flapjacks and eggs and smoked bacon and grits to boot. Them boys lapped that up in a squinted, I tell you. Well, Buster and Walter got fuller than two ticks on a hog's back and reared back in a couple of chairs out in the front porch, whilst Hired and Jesse was still eating and visiting with Miss Dixon. Well, when the boys finished their eating and got their fill, Buster seen an old 55 Mercury a-sitting off to the side, and just happened to ask Hubert what he was doing with that there V8 just a-sitting there. Well, Hubert told Buster she just wouldn't run too far without a-quitting. Well, Buster told Walter and Hired to have a look-see with him and see if they couldn't get her to run. Well, after the boys piddled around with that Merc, they got her to purring like a kitten. Buster said to hop on in and they would take her for a spin. Well, she run like a scalded dog, I tell you. Well, Hubert said his and Pa had a new pickup truck, and the old Mercury was given to him so they could use it whilst they was at the camp if they wanted to. Well, Jesse said they sure couldn't let on about that there car and had to sneak on out if they went anywhere and would have to find a way of slipping out of camp without getting caught. Well, Hubert said he had just the ticket. He knowed them woods better than anybody and knowed all the trails. The boys stopped by a little store and stocked up on all manner of snacks and candy bars and such before they went on back to camp. They hid out to eat till dark and then brung them into the barracks. Word got out and the fellers and gals was all a-twitter trying to get some of them eats the boys brought back with them. Well, over the next few days, Buster and Jesse would slip out, followed by Walter and Hired, into the woods and meet up with Hubert and get the Mercury and head into town. Now, all the boys been driving by themselves since they was 9-year-old or even younger in some cases. So it weren't nothing new to them, but Buster was the driver. Well, one night by the fireside, a gal sat down across Buster and she was a looker for short. Her name was Bubbles. Well, Bubbles and Buster hit it right off from the start, and her girlfriends took up with the rest of the boys. All of them began to sneak out and take that Mercury to town and to paint it red. They'd go to the picture show or to the ice cream parlor and then ease on back to the camp. Well, one night it got late, but Buster was hungry, and him and the boys stopped at a little diner before heading on back to camp. Well, Hired done spied one of them counselors driving up to the diner and told the boys they had got to leave. Jesse throwed down, I get tickled thinking about it. Jesse throwed down enough money to cover the bill, and all of them went out the back door. The boys knowed they'd better get on back to camp pronto, so Buster give her his gas and burned rubber when he hit the blacktop. Well, it just so happened the police car seen Buster do that, and the chase was on. You would have thought they was in the moving picture show Thunder Road, the way Buster was taking them mountain roads. He was up on two wheels on one curve. When Hubert told Buster to kill the lights and make a turn, you just couldn't see that was into the woods. Buster done what Hubert said to do, and on the speed of trust, and Hubert got him hid, and the police passed him on by. They lit on out to the camp and stuck into bed before they got caught. Well, it seems like Howard dropped his camp ID at the diner, and the waitress give it to the counselor to take on back to camp for Howard. The fat was in the fire for sure. The head counselor rousted out the boys and wanted to know what all was going on, because it proved they was into town, and that was a fur piece to walk. Well, Preacher Templeton was woke up and the questions started to coming. Now, none of the boys, including Hubert, was in the habit of lying, but they sure didn't want Hubert in no trouble. Buster said he was doing the driving and he was the one to blame. Now, Walter and Howard and Jesse would have none of that and told Preacher Templeton they was there too. They didn't tell on Hubert though, but Hubert spoke right up and said it was his car. Well, Preacher Templeton said he had heard about all the snacks and goodies the boys brung in, but just didn't know who was doing it. Now he did. He asked how in the world it come about. Well, sir, Buster said it was all 'cause of them being hungry and wanting something to eat. Oh, I know y'all don't think any of this is true, but it is. Well, after the story was told, Preacher Templeton said no more going to town, and he'd see to it that the boys and anybody else would get plenty to eat. The boys had to be scolded and all, and their folks called, but learning all them Bible verses was the hardest thing for them to do. Well, Howard and Walter had a devil of a time reciting theirs, but Jesse and Buster did just fine and had to help out Howard and Walter with theirs. Now, when the boys' balls went to pick up the boys when they got on back, there was heck to pay. The onlyest thing that saved them was that a young'un was swimming out and seen a snake and got scared and run off and tripped and fell and broke her arm. Bone come right through the skin. The boys was a-talking to the gals when Bubbles hollered out to help the little gal. Well, Jesse and Howard used their scout training and first aid, and Buster and Walter lit out to get to Mercury. Well, Hubert took them on an old logging road right on up about where the little gal fell down, and the boys put her in the back seat of the car and hated to town with her to the doctor. Well, Bubbles and the gals run and told Preacher Templeton what done happened, and that Buster and the boys rushed the little gal to the doctor in town. Well, after all was said and done, the little gal's ma said how much she appreciated the boys helping her little gal, and told that all the boys' ma's and Preacher Templeton that too. Now, the boys was heroes, but not out of the woods yet. The next Sunday, the boys had to recite Bible verses in church on Sunday morning and night, and Wednesday evening too, to show what all they learned at camp. Oh, guess what? The boys was made counselors the next year at camp. Now, don't that beat all? The boys went to camp about every year till they got out of high school and always had a story. Them young'uns that come to camp could never get nothing on them boys, that's for sure. They knowed all the tricks. Seems like eating was always in the middle of whatever the boys was a-doing. After camp that first year, harvest come in a bit early, and everybody had a bumper crop. A barn dance and a feed was put on for the families of the little country community of Slovak where Aunt Rosie lived. She was the matriarch of the Catholic Church there, and that's when the finest feast you ever seen was put on. The boys invited Hubert and his folks to come on too, and they had a weekend of purity fun. Now, Bubbles and them other gals were just friends, like they was fun to get to know, but the boys never seen them again. They is still friends with Hubert, though, and the boys' folks keep in touch right often. One day when Buster and the boys was all growed up, a feller drove up to Buster's house with a car pulling in behind him. Buster went out to see who all it was and come to visit, and lo and behold, it was Hubert. He was doing right well, because the natural gas was found on his and folks' place, and Southern Natural Gas, where Jesse's pa worked, made him a millionaire. Hubert had the old Mercury restored and brung it to Buster because he knowed how much he loved that Mercury V8. Buster's eyes rolled back like window shades when Hubert tossed him the keys. Over the years, they always spoke of the fun and good times at their first year of camp in that Mercury. Buster was plumb tongue-tied for sure and hugged old Hubert, blubbering how much it meant to him to have that old Mercury V8. Hubert and his cousin stayed the night, and Buster and Hired picked up the other boys, and the Queen had come in for the day to visit with Hubert and the Mercury. They all had a good time of reliving the memories and then went on out to get something to eat. The best restaurant in the state was downtown where they went to eat. You could get all a body wanted to eat there, and they knowed the owners. It was the boys. Place was called Rosie's. Have a blessed day, folks. Hope you enjoyed the story.